Hello everyone, welcome to Science Factory. This week we are bringing back one of the incredible interviews we published previously on La Fábrica de la Ciencia. And what a better way to start than with a very special guest, Colleen Darnell, also known as Vintage Egyptologist. In this interview, she shares her passion for ancient Egypt, her unique approach to research, and of course her amazing vintage style. Make sure to watch it until the end, and if you have any questions for Colleen, leave them in the comments. That way, when we have her back in the future, we can ask her what you want to know. Enjoy the interview. Hello, welcome Colleen Darnell to La Fábrica de la Ciencia. It's a great pleasure to have you here. As I already told you, you look great. I'm very impressed and I'm looking forward to our conversation and our interview that I hope you enjoy. So we wanted to know, me and the followers of the program, what sparked your initial interest in Egyptology and especially the areas you focused on?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on, and it is a pleasure to speak with you. My interest in Egyptology goes back to when I was a kid. I loved reading books. There was a museum collection where I grew up in St. Louis at the Art Museum. And really, ever since I can remember, I have wanted to learn more about ancient Egypt and especially to study hieroglyphs. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Yale University for my bachelor's as well as my PhD. And since then, I have been absolutely blessed to be able to work in the field of Egyptology, archaeological expeditions in Egypt, publishing, and now teaching all around the world on Zoom.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know if you maybe remember, because in my case, I had the same. I read a book about Egypt when I was 10. And since then, I fell in love with Egypt and ancient Egyptian history. Do you remember the first book you read by any chance?
Yes. So it was one of those DK eyewitness history books.
Okay.
And I can remember distinctly the reconstruction of the Temple of Bahri and Hatshepsut consulting with Senenmut. And that really, really sticks in my mind.
Okay, yeah, that's something we have in common because actually the first book I read about Egypt was a novel, but it was about Hatshepsut.
Which novel was it?
It was, yeah, in Spanish, La Dama del Nilo. Actually, I don't know if I have a copy here. I don't think so. I read it that time and I never read it again. But I remember especially that I read that book. And since then, I started to read Christian Jack's books because they were at home. And then I started to get more and more into Egyptology. And now all these books are about Egyptology and different fields. But yeah, that was my very first book about Egypt and also Hatshepsut. So I understand your feeling. And how has your perspective on Egyptology evolved through your career?
I'm so glad you asked that because it's very important, I think, to emphasize when you have an interest since you're a child. Obviously, that's not the same interest you have decades later. And so, through my research, particularly translating hieroglyphic and hieratic texts, as well as studying the archaeological material, that my approach that I have become increasingly emphasizing in my classes, in my research, for example, in the book that John and I co-wrote, Egypt's Golden Couple, that even when you popularize the material, even when you present that material to the public, absolutely ensuring that everything goes back to the primary sources. So not simply reading about ancient Egypt, seeing what other people have to say, but making sure that larger statements, analysis, even imaginative reconstructions that we do in the beginning of the chapters has a basis in a hieroglyphic text or an object that has been excavated. And so my approach, as I've really, I mean, that was there from the beginning, certainly from the time I was at university for my bachelor's and PhD, but increasingly trying to mash that attention to primary sources with being able to present that material to the public. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which my career as an Egyptologist has transformed, is working just as much with documentaries and public-facing material and classes that can be accessible to everyone. And obviously then also doing the very serious academic research where the audience is going to be mostly other Egyptologists.
Uh-huh. And I'm curious about this. The first time you traveled to Egypt, how old were you? Were you young, or it was already when you started your studies and so on?
I was 18 when I first traveled to Egypt, and it was a graduation present from high school from my parents. And so they came with me, and it was magical. And I absolutely fell in love. Not only, I mean, I had already fallen in love with ancient Egypt, but also the country and the people. It is such a special place and so welcoming, and that's never changed. And that's one aspect that I really love about being an Egyptologist, is also being able to engage with Egyptian Egyptologists as well as photographers and creatives and videographers in Egypt, and have those sorts of relationships on the ground.
Curious about that because Egypt is a huge shock. It's a huge cultural shock. For me, the first time I traveled to Egypt, I was around 25 or something like that. And I knew it was going to be a shock because I already knew that, and that the ancient Egyptian was no longer the Egyptian nowadays. But I remember it as a huge shock. And then a few years back, I moved to Egypt because I lived in Egypt for a year and a half. But working as an engineer, so it has nothing to do with Egyptology. But I remember that I had to get myself ready for to assume that shock, because I was going to be living there, and the cultural shock is so different. It's so amazing for me. It was an amazing experience, but I'm aware that it's that the people's experiences can be so different because of that shock. The perspectives of everyone are completely different. That I was curious about yours because it's amazing, and when you have high expectations about, in this case, Egypt, reality can be different from our expectations. So I'm glad your expectations were fulfilled and even overcome. And
Oh,
yeah,
no,
sorry.
definitely, I feel like my expectations have been exceeded. And now, having traveled to Egypt so much, I mean, my husband and I spend 3 months of the year working with his expedition that he directs from Yale University, the El Kab Desert Survey Project. So it feels like home. And I have advised so many people recently about traveling to Egypt and helped them kind of plan an itinerary. And every single person has said that it is the most amazing travel experience they've ever had. And
Absolutely. Go ahead, sorry.
oh, and so that's something I always like to emphasize, because as you say, there often is an expectation of a culture shock. And I think sometimes a reticence to travel to Egypt because people don't understand the circumstances. And I always like to promote, go travel. And that's fabulous that you got to live there for a year and a half.
The best year of my life. Really, it was amazing. As I said, people is so welcoming, and they appreciate it a lot that I was so in love with ancient Egypt. It was super funny because my Egyptian colleagues used to ask me where to go, what to visit, how to do it. So I would give them telephone numbers of my friends in Luxor and stuff like that. And they were my Egyptian colleagues. So it was kind of interesting. It was an interesting experience in so many ways. And now also I travel to Egypt once or twice a year, and it's also the more you travel to Egypt, the more you learn how to move and how to interact with people, and it's even more and more every time I go. It becomes even better and better and better, and I can't get enough of it. And how often do well, you said you spent 3 months a year there, and then you also travel with groups and stuff, right? And things like that.
So now I've just been traveling for the archaeological expeditions, and uh, because of John's teaching schedule at Yale, we travel from the beginning of December through the middle of January, and then again end of April, beginning of May through early June.
Okay. That's nice. I'm going to be there in April, but I will be in other areas, so I'm afraid we can't see each other this time. But I hope that in the future we are in Egypt at the same time and we can see each other and have a coffee. And how do you connect the study of ancient fashion to contemporary ideas about dress and identity?
Mm. We see in the ancient Egyptian documents, as in cultures all throughout time and all around the world, the use of fashion to express identity. And one of my favorite examples of that is in the fictional story of Sinuhe. And Sinuhe is a man who, at least according to the fictional tale, lived about 1950, 1900, between there, BCE, although the text was certainly composed a little bit later. And he is an Egyptian who is a high official at the Queen's palace. So he knows the royal family, he knows the Queen personally. And he overhears a news report of the assassination of the king. And he panics and flees. And he flees beyond the Sinai Peninsula to the northeast. And after having various adventures in what the ancient Egyptians called the land of retinue, he returns to Egypt. And when he returns to Egypt and is reintegrated into Egyptian society, the process of that reintegration is expressed through clothing. His head is shaved, the sand is shaken from his clothing, all of his other garments are put away, and then he is properly coiffed and perfumed and wearing white linen and proper sandals and sleeping in a bed. And all of that signals that he is again an Egyptian. At the same time, foreigners, Libyans, Nubians living in Egypt could be fully integrated into Egyptian society, and particularly with Nubian soldiers, maintain aspects of their native dress. So they might wear an Egyptian kilt, but with a decorated leather apron over that kilt, signaling that they are a Nubian soldier. And we have this represented in ancient Egyptian stele, where they're married to Egyptian women and based on the texts on monuments, also believed in an Egyptian afterlife. And I think it's fascinating to see how clothing represents identity. But at the same time, there was not a demand for complete assimilation where you only could wear Egyptian clothes to be a fully functioning member of Egyptian society.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, you've done fascinating work on ancient Egyptian fashion and adornment. So, can you talk about any particularly interesting discovery related to this?
I think one of the aspects of ancient Egyptian fashion where I've been able to make a little bit of a contribution, and I haven't published this yet, but I've talked about it at lectures and in my Zoom classes on ancient Egyptian dress and fashion, and the wrap dresses are very interesting. This is a fashion that we see during the New Kingdom, and it is a single piece of pleated white linen cloth, so a very large rectangle. And the question is then, how do you take a large rectangular piece of cloth and make it into a dress? And so I have experimented, and John's helped me with this a lot because of his understanding of, how these various elements in the textiles work, like how you can drape things. And this helps too with the comparison of vintage fashion, which I'll talk about in a moment. And basically, you can hold one corner up to your shoulder, wrap it around, and then tie the other corner. And because during the wrapping process, as you go around, the fabric is diagonal, meaning it is on the bias. And you can, with a single rectangular piece of cloth and no additional pins or any other fastening methods, create a dress that is both form-fitting but also enables movement. And this is something that we see particularly in the 1930s and spectacularly in 1930s evening gowns, where because the fabric is cut on the bias and then sewn, so that you wouldn't have had the sewn seams, obviously, with ancient Egyptian fashion. It's the same thing where you have just two pieces of fabric cut on the bias sewed together in 1930s fashion. And it is very form-fitting and yet flexible, even though there is no stretch material. And it simply has to do with the way the fibers uh, lay, how it drapes. And that's been really fun. And I'm looking forward to doing more research about that and publishing it as well.
That sounds amazing. It's a topic I really don't know a lot about, but it's truly amazing what you're doing. And you were saying that in New Kingdom, this was very important. What makes the New Kingdom such a compelling period to study?
I first got into researching the New Kingdom through military history. And that's something that has really continued throughout my research. My first book was a translation and commentary of a text that had not been very well studied. In fact, there were no really detailed analyses and commentaries of the text. And it is a inscription that dates to about 1208 BC during the reign of Merneptah, the successor of Ramses II, and he fights a major battle against a combined Libyan and Sea People force. And this then not only impacts ancient Egyptian history, but the changes that are wrought by these Sea Peoples all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And then through other publications, analyzing more the military history because that's the time of ancient Egypt's empire. And in 2013, I published an analysis and translation of 4 works of historical fiction that the ancient Egyptians wrote. And this is really fascinating because since by the time of the New Kingdom, ancient Egyptian history is already 2,000 years old. It's a perfect time period to see the interaction of the ancient Egyptians with their own past. And the fact that they were studying their own history and then writing fictional tales based on that history. And all 4 works of historical fiction revolve around military events. So a siege, a battle, and the king can have a role, but also one of the characters is a man named Jehudi, who's a general. So we get a sense of a non-royal person who is fictionalized. And we don't know ancient Egyptian curriculum in schools. But these stories would not have been entertaining if you didn't have some background in the history. So it was also a really great way to get at what was the knowledge that the ancient Egyptians had about their own past. And that's one of many things that I love about the New Kingdom, the other being the funerary texts, the netherworld books in the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And in 2018, John and I published the first complete English translation of those texts in the Writings of the Ancient World series. And that was incredibly fun.
And do you have a personal favorite funerary text? I mean,
I would
what's
say
your favorite part? Because, well, these texts are very complex and very difficult to understand and to, well, divide. The division is recent. Let's say the ancient Egyptians didn't divide the texts as different books. But what is your favorite part, or what you like the most about this funerary compositions or literature?
it's hard to pick just one. But I I would say probably some of the passages in the Litany of Re. And we know that the Egyptians did consider that a distinct composition. They called it the Book of Adoring Re in the West. And it's mostly confined to the first two corridors of the royal tombs that contain the Litany of Re tags. And in those litanies, there are very pithy statements that get to the heart of ancient Egyptian religion, particularly solar religion, which is fundamental to ancient Egyptian religion overall. And there is praise to the jubilating baboon and the great cat, and there are scarab forms, and it really is represents the manifestations of the sun god and the ability to play with just a few short epithets that then allude to much, much larger theological episodes. And that's really neat because you can read it on one level, which is okay, it's describing the sun as a great cat. We even see that, for example, in the Book of the Dead. But the more you know about ancient Egyptian solar religion, the more those other epithets really make sense and add information. It's similar then to the historical fiction, that it requires a certain knowledge already in order to appreciate. And then I would say the second most compelling part of ancient Egyptian funerary texts is the cryptography. And that is a topic that John worked on extensively for his dissertation on cryptographic netherworld books in the tombs of Tutankhamun, Ramses VI, and Ramses IX. And I did an article about the cryptography in the Book of Gates. And they're hieroglyphs, but with highly abnormal values. And it really, in order to be able to read it, you have to fully immerse yourself. You have to really try to think like an ancient Egyptian.
That sounds incredible. Really, I have actually, I think I have John's book somewhere around the cryptography one. I used it for a dissertation, so say hello from me.
I certainly will. Yeah, he's teaching at Yale today, so.
He's at work. Okay. Next time he can join us also. We can invite him for sure. It would be a pleasure. We can do an interview with you both if you like.
That would be great.
An idea. And how did magic and religion intertwined in ancient Egyptian life?
Great question. This is something that I have taught extensively in my Zoom classes. I've done an ancient Egyptian magic class, how to cast a spell in ancient Egypt, as well as a class on magic, alchemy, and hermeticism. And I find magic is such a great hook because it's something that is very popular and very interesting. And then it becomes a conduit to explain how integrated magic and religion are in ancient Egypt. And so the main answer to your question would be that magic and religion are what magic is a subset of ancient Egyptian religion. The word for magic is Hekka, and a Middle Kingdom literary text specifically says that the creator god gifted Hekka to people in order to ward off bad events. In the Netherworld books, magic is required to defeat Apep, the chaos serpent. Re traveling through, in this case, the seventh hour of the night, would be stopped in his tracks were it not for the great magician and Isis, who we know is also a goddess heavily associated with effective magic. And the sun god himself utters magical incantations, magical spells in order to overcome Apep. So magic, in a way, is almost like gravity. It's a force that you can harness, and it is fully in line with ancient Egyptian religion. And it's not cult practices and rituals that would have been performed in temples. You wouldn't define as specifically magical. The Egyptians would not classify that as Hekka. But Hekka is a force that in the cosmos created by gods that can be used for very practical effect. And we predominantly have magic used for positive ends in ancient Egypt. And it's only later in Egyptian history that you begin to see the black magic applications and the idea of magic used to harm people. Now, in an ancient Egyptian context, you do have magic used to harm enemies. So I should modify that slightly by saying that the definition of magic for good purposes defined by the ancient Egyptians would be magic in the service of Ma'at, in maintaining divine order. And this is one of the reasons why in a magical spell, you could actually threaten the gods. If you are sick, if you do not heal me, if you do not make this illness go away, Osiris himself will suffer. Because what the Egyptians are calling upon is that their own sickness is not in balance with Ma'at. And so they're even willing to threaten the gods to reassert the proper order of the cosmos. And that's the same concept with enemies, where a foreign rebel or even a rebel in Egypt itself, which we know, they use this same magic against. When those enemies threaten Ma'at, the magic can help to restore that balance. So it is definitely contextually, it's very, very important to look at the context when speaking about ancient Egyptian magical practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, can you describe a memorable experience you've had during an archaeological dig? Well, we are switching conversations a bit now. Can you tell us more about your experience in the field in Egypt on site?
Absolutely. I'm going to share two experiences that are among my favorite. The first was in 2009, actually, Christmas. No, 2010, excuse me. Christmas Day on 2010, I was directing an archaeological expedition called the Moala Survey Project. So that's a site about 45 minutes south of Luxor on the east bank of the Nile. And there was a sketch map in an article by Georg Schweinfurt from 1904. And John had given me a copy of the article, and he said, this is something you might want to investigate because, I was surveying the area. And there was a sketch map saying, okay, you go east into the desert at this particular location, then you take a south through the a right turn to the south through another wadi, and there are all of these structures. But Schweinfurt wasn't certain about the date of the structures. He thought they might be later medieval. So on Christmas Day, with my amazing Egyptian colleagues, we went out, followed the sketch map, and there were over 100 structures. And through studying the pottery, they ended up being late antique. So essentially about 450 to 700 CE. And that took me very much out of my normal specialization, right? We were just talking about the New Kingdom. Yeah, this is very far removed chronologically. And it was a lot of fun to pick up that topic. And then subsequently, with the El Khab Desert Survey Project that John directs, we have discovered half a dozen more of these sites. And really, through studying all of them, been able to prove that they were constructed, inhabited by, and all the pottery and most of the pottery is standard, late Roman, late antique. But there's also some specific handmade pottery. And essentially, all of these structures and some associated burials relate to an Eastern Desert dwelling group known as Blemmies in the classical sources. And actually, there's a Demotic example as well. And really being able to flesh out our understanding of these people. And that's been really exciting. And then, of course, the other discovery that it was incredible to be a part of. This was also with John's expedition in 2017, where we discovered the oldest monumental hieroglyphic inscription. And that it was one of the top 10 discoveries in Archaeology magazine in 2017. And because of the technological advances, the application of technology with Metashape, which is now used all the time, but at that point taking Metashape So 2D photos to create a 3D model, exporting an ortho image onto an iPad, and then tracing that with vectors. And this was a technique that we developed with an amazing Yale colleague, Alberto Urcia, and together melding sort of traditional epigraphic techniques to copy rock art with these new technologies. And so John and I published that inscription in the summer in the Explorers Club journal. So within 3 months of discovering it, we had an initial publication for the public. And then by December, John had published a very detailed academic article in Archaeoneo.
Okay, I will check that because it sounds really, really interesting for me. And we almost have to finish. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your social media profile and what motivates you to give these Zoom classes, to all the activities you do, all the content you create for social media. What inspires you to do that? It's the rest of the world, we are very grateful for that because you create very, very interesting content. But what you enjoy the most about this?
I have been overwhelmed with how popular my Instagram has become. I was not expecting it to really take off to that extent. And to know that by writing elaborate captions, doing lives, and then giving the possibility of diving in deep with the Zoom classes, to be able to disseminate research. And a lot of that obviously is John's research and my research, and translating the academic topics and these new discoveries in a way that is accessible to people all around the world. And I feel like that is one of the most important goals of being an academic, is not simply to speak to other academics, although there is a place for that with publications and very technical publications. But at the same time, that should be accompanied by making that information accessible to everyone, whether it be through a blog on my website, as I mentioned in Instagram Live, or the Zoom classes. And that is one of my favorite parts of being an Egyptologist in the in the world where there is social media. It's the perfect tool to draw people in and show them the possibilities of learning more. And I have some people who have been taking my Zoom classes for 4 years now. It's the 4-year anniversary since I started my Zoom program, and we have read the Hymn to Aten in hieroglyphs from beginning to end. And we are more than halfway through the story of Sinewe. And to be able to share that and experience it with people all around the world. And I learn so much from them because the questions people ask, the approaches that they have, teaches me a lot, and I think makes me a better scholar.
Absolutely. I was going to ask precisely that. Have you had that experience that a student has asked you a question that has made you like have a different perspective because that person maybe is not an expert in this specific topic, but and that's why he sees that person sees the topic from a different perspective. So it gives you a different idea also about the theme you're talking about. Have you had that too?
Many times where questions will get me thinking about a topic from a new perspective. And when we were discussing kind of how the approach to Egyptology has changed for me over the decades, I would say reaching such a large audience and then learning about all of these different perspectives, and then being asked, well, how do we know this? Or what if it is related to this particular topic or has this connection? And that's one of the ways in which I feel my approach to Egyptology has changed so much. It's simply broadening my horizons because of all of these amazing questions from people who, no, they're not experts, they're not trained, say, Egyptology PhDs, but that doesn't mean that they can't make an incredible contribution to understanding the topic simply because everyone's going to have different experiences and look at it from different perspective. And that's been a great learning experience for me and one of my favorite aspects of social media and the Zoom classes.
Yeah, and also if they have a different professional background, for example, they can bring that into this topic. So that can be interesting, because maybe an Egyptologist is not going to be to see something specific from that other perspective. So that can be like the interdisciplinary approach, which is something very appreciated at the moment, I think, and I think it's amazing. And well, so we've reached the end of our conversation, unfortunately, but hopefully we can do this again whenever you want or whenever you're available. And it was a great pleasure for us to have you here. I hope you enjoyed your time with us, and you're always going to be welcome.
Thank you so much. And I absolutely loved speaking with you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.